I'm Robert Manne. I'll give a very brief introduction to David, who, in my opinion, is the most influential Australian in the area of Middle Eastern policy in the United States.
Martin Indyk would be upset to hear you say that.
Yeah, I still, whether he's upset or not, I still think it's true. I'm going to, for those who don't know David's background, I'll just read, and I'm going to read from the description he gives of himself in, is it Kairos Associates? Mm-hmm. The business that he now owns. He served for 25 years as a light infantry officer in the Australian Army. He then served with the US State Department, where he was chief strategist in the Counter-Terrorism Bureau, senior counter-insurgency advisor to General David Petraeus in Iraq, and senior advisor for counter-insurgency to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. He advises world institutions, governments, businesses, etc., and is the author of a number of books: The Accidental Guerrilla, Counter-Insurgency, and Out of the Mountains, The Coming Age of the Urban Guerrilla. It was something I didn't know, actually. We Google it in the modern age, so I Googled you. And something I hadn't known is that you, in 2006, you were the subject of a profile in The New Yorker by one of the great American journalists, George Packer.
George Packer, yeah.
And I might read, just to give you a sense of the places that David was moving in only a couple of years after arriving in Washington. This is from the final paragraph of that profile in what's probably, I think, the best magazine in the English-speaking world, apart from the Monthly. Maury's here. Cullen, this is the end of George Packer's profile. Cullen's strategic mind, by contrast, seems remarkably febrile. I could call him at the office or at home at any hour of the night and he'd be jotting down ideas in one of his little black notebooks, ready to think out loud. Kilcullen, Crumpton, an associate, and their colleagues are desperately trying to develop a lasting new strategy that, in Kilcullen's words, would be neither Republican nor Democratic. Kilcullen is now in charge of writing a new counter-insurgency manual for the civilian government. And earlier this month he briefed Condoleezza Rice on his findings in Afghanistan. But his ideas have yet to penetrate the fortress, that is the Bush White House. That was just to come soon after. There's a heck of a lot in the quarterly essay, and it's a privilege to be able to talk to someone who was so close to power and who understands intimately the kinds of thinking, but also the on-the-ground realities of. And I'll begin with something that you say. You describe the invasion of Iraq as the greatest strategic mistake made by a great power since Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. And rather than, I mean, I think we all know here the kind of what you're referring to, but what really intrigues me, because you knew the people, even you were in the presence of George W. Bush on occasion, what were they thinking, do you think, in 2003?
That is the question, isn't it? I mean, I actually think that it goes back to 2001, and this is just a personal theory, but if you think about what happened to people in the Bush cabinet on 9/11, right? President Bush and Secretary Rice she was then National Security Advisor, were in Air Force One expecting to be shot down. You know, Dick Cheney was hunkered down in the basement of the White House expecting a plane to strike the building. Paul Wolfowitz, the Deputy Secretary of Defence, and Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defence, carried dead bodies out of the building, right? So they were all directly affected with this fear of death on the day. And 2 days later, 2 days after 9/11, they meet for the first time at Camp David, and they're still dirty and smelling of smoke, and they've just come out of this very disruptive period. And somebody at that meeting says, hey, we should attack Iraq. you know, and someone, I think probably George Tenet, the CIA chief, says, hang on a second, you know, Iraqis had nothing to do with this. So they shelve it and they go on to look about Afghanistan. But I've always felt that those words spoken then under those conditions amongst that group had almost a sort of post-hypnotic effect later on. So when they got Afghanistan done, they were like, oh yeah, now we have to attack Iraq. And you would ask people, why are we attacking Iraq? Why are we doing this? And their eyes would like literally glaze over, like they didn't know the reason why, we were just going to do it. And I think amongst the more reflective members of that group, so I would put Wolfowitz very much in that category. He's the only one I ever heard express remorse for the invasion, but also Condi particularly. Very thoughtful and engaged. They are still asking themselves that question, like what came over us, you know? And I would add, there are Iraqis who joined the uprising against us who are also asking the question, what came over us?
Yeah.
You know, so it's a sort of a collective badness that struck people after 9/11.
My favourite joke about it, and one shouldn't joke about it, but my favourite is from Richard Clarke, the counter-terrorism person, who said the decision to invade Iraq was like a decision to invade Mexico following Pearl Harbor. But I mean, I think people here will be interested, and you do write about this in the quarterly essay, but how did you get to Washington? Because, you know, you've only, you know, the thing I read from George Packer, you've only been there for a couple of years at that stage.
Yeah, well, but, you know, things move fast in wartime, right? So you sort of pick things quickly. Well, you know, I was in the Australian Army, and I had been an advisor with Indonesian Special Forces and running training teams up in Indonesia in the 1990s, and had stumbled across this big Islamic uprising that happened in the 50s and 60s in Indonesia. And I had been in the middle of doing a PhD about something boring. I can't even remember what it was now, some, you know, Australian defence policy issue. And I went back to my PhD supervisor and said, I'd like to dump that topic and look at this Islamic uprising that happened in Indonesia called Darul Islam. And it turned out that actually there was still a very significant group of people engaged in underground activity in Indonesia in the mid-90s when I was doing this work. And they later turned into JI, the guys who did the Bali bombing. And so I literally had submitted my PhD for grading 6 weeks before 9/11 without having any anticipation that, you know, like people used to say to me, what are you studying Islamic insurgency for? Like, when's that ever going to happen? You know, and I was like, I don't know. You know, I didn't have some kind of premonition that it would be useful. But Bali bombing happens, you know, 9/11 happens, the Bali bombing happens. It's hard to remember now, but at the time there weren't a lot of people that knew anything about the particular people as distinct from the phenomenon of terrorism. And so I was seconded to do some work looking after that stuff. And I wrote a critique of the war on terrorism, which I quote from slightly in the essay, where I basically said, look, we're doing this all wrong. We're aggregating all these effects together and treating it like it's one set of, you know, we're making the Iranians in the same basket as Al-Qaeda, and, you know, we need to disaggregate that and break it up. And Wolfowitz actually read that paper, which was circulated in the military side, and wrote to Australia and said, can we borrow Dave, basically, to come and help out with this strategy? And Australia was like, no, well, we can do better than a lieutenant colonel. We'd give you a general. And they were like, no, we want that guy. So there was a bit of back and forth, and eventually I went over to Washington, and I met a bunch of people in CIA and Special Operations Command and so on as I was doing that work. And one of those is this guy, Hank Crumpton, who you mentioned, who was appointed as their ambassador for counter-terrorism. And he basically asked Australia to put me on loan to him as his chief of strategy. And that's how I ended up there, you know. And then I ended up going to Iraq and, you know, Pakistan and Afghanistan and Somalia and all these places. So once you get into it, it's kind of hard to break it.
Yeah. I imagine Canberra would feel rather dull after that.
I love Canberra, but, you know, there's not a lot of what I do that goes on in Canberra, you know. Yeah. Well, it's the thing, right? I mean,
I want to get to Iraq. When did you go on the ground to Iraq?
First time I went there was late 2005. And at that time, we were still... The narrative of Iraq at that time was that it had been bad, but that it was getting better. And I talk in the book about, in the essay, about how one night I was sitting outside in Baghdad, and this 2 helicopters passed overhead really quickly, popping flares. They dropped these really bright flares to confuse anti-aircraft missiles scared the crap out of me, you know. And I was sitting there and I'm like, it just suddenly hit me, you know, we've been here for 3 years, we've got 160,000 troops in country, and we can't move from one end of downtown Baghdad to the other without that. Like, we're losing, you know. Yeah. And that was my sort of big revelation when I was first there, that maybe it looks okay on the surface, but it's not. And it was only a week or two after that the big Samarra bombing happened, yeah, that just turned it into a massive sectarian bloodbath, and it all kind of steamrolled from there.
And, you know, I want to move to maybe the most important work you did, which was in Iraq, anyhow, during the surge, and working. You were called an advisor to General Petraeus, but you say it wasn't really...
I suppose that was technically my position, but he doesn't need advice on counter-insurgency. I mean, he literally wrote the book on it. So my job was advising the units.
Could you say a bit about what you did and what the situation, in your view, was at the time of the surge, and you know, an assessment of how it went?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think at the beginning of 2006, when the Samarra bombing happened, what that was Zarqawi's team deciding we're losing the war under its current terms, we need to transform it. And so they tried to turn it from being an uprising against the Americans into a Sunni Shia sectarian civil war, and they were massively effective at that, right? I mean, within a few weeks after the Samarra bombing, something like 5,000 Sunni bodies turned up dead in the streets of Baghdad alone, right? Because they'd successfully provoked the Shia by blowing up the most important Shia shrine in Iraq into this retaliation against the Sunnis. And it just went downhill from there. And by the end of 2006, Iraqi society was basically tearing itself apart. You know, ethnic cleansing, huge amount of bloodshed, and I get into it in some detail in the essay. And to his credit, President Bush, and I was not a fan, as I think it's pretty clear if you read the essay, President Bush realised a change had to be made, and he fired Secretary Rumsfeld, sidelined Vice President Cheney, and basically took the reins directly into his own hands and said, we're going to win this thing, and here's how we're going to do it. And he laid out a strategy of basically shifting the focus away from attacking the enemy and trying to leave as fast as possible to protecting the population instead and trying to stabilise. And it's been characterised as counterinsurgency, which is an okay description, but I would actually describe what we did during the surge, when I was there anyway, as more like heavy peacekeeping. What we were trying to do was basically just stop them from killing each other and create enough space that politicians could engage and try to solve the underlying issue. We were dramatically successful with the first bit, you know, stopping the violence. We got violence down by about 80% within 2 years. Incident numbers were down by 90%. Casualties dropped by about 85%. Really significantly, you know, we took it from a few thousand dead civilians every week to, you know, 100 across the whole country, which is still bad, but it's nothing like it was. That bit, we did okay. The political piece totally failed. And what we basically did was created space for Iraqi politicians to make a deal that they had no intention of making, right? And it just never came together. And I think if we had sustained the effort a little bit longer, it may have resulted in a better outcome. But that's an imponderable now because we didn't, you know, we pulled out.
There's one of the things that interested me in the essay, it's a brief passage, but you say in his public persona, George Bush was painful in this, you know, up all the time and cheerful and misleading the public about what was happening. But you saw him in private and you thought he was a much more formidable character there.
Yeah,
Can you say something about that?
Sure. I mean, I was always a bit puzzled by the president's approach. He, I think, felt that he needed to be sort of folksy and upbeat and kind of man in the street whenever it was on the media. And frankly, I found it, not that my opinion mattered, you know, I was just a technical guy, but I found it kind of grating, you know, like I would come out of these really dangerous environments in Iraq and he'd be there on television saying how, you know, we're kicking the evildoers, you know, but then when the media wasn't there, he was totally different. You know, he was across all the details. He knew things that, you know, you wouldn't have expected him to know about what was happening on the ground. He had a very realistic appreciation of what was and wasn't working. And he really communicated well with the Iraqis particularly about the partnership and what he was trying to achieve. He was dramatically better. He's a guy who I think his public persona just didn't do justice to his actual grasp of the problem. none of which is any excuse for invading the country in the first place, right? We should have never been there. But I think when he finally did engage and started taking charge of it, that was one of the big things that really began to turn it around.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that's interesting in the essay, in the analysis, is that my reading is that you're, if anything, even more hostile to President Obama than you are to Bush. And I mean, the line that comes up twice in the essay, which is, you can either leave early or you can leave well. And you clearly believe that the Americans left too early and badly.
I do.
And, I mean, and I had a question about that. I mean, it was George Bush that came to the agreement about leaving, the timetable, but it was also, as I understood it, that Bush couldn't get an agreement, status of forces agreement as it was called, for the Americans not to have immunity from being charged under Iraqi law, and that became a problem. Say a little bit about the leaving badly, both the bigger question and this more minor technical question.
Yeah, I'm just going to pick you up on one thing though. I know you didn't mean this, but you said the Americans left. Like, we were there too, right? I mean, yeah, right. I think Aussies have this tendency to walk away and say, oh, the American invasion of Iraq. No, we were there, right?
I promise you I don't do that.
It's as much our fault as anyone else's. Perhaps more in some ways, because the Allies kind of got in the boat and then didn't try to influence in any way the strategy. And then when things got bad, just ran for the hills, you know. And I think Aussies are actually a little bit better on it than the Brits. The Brits act like they were never involved, you know, but actually that whole dodgy dossier that led us into Iraq, a lot of that was British stuff, you know. But, you know, back to your question, I think maybe, I hope that I don't come off as hostile to President Obama. I guess what I am is kind of disappointed, because he came in with a real promise of fixing a lot of the things that the Bush administration had got wrong. And when he took over, you know, there was plenty of blame to go around, but, you know, almost all of it attached to the preceding administration. And with just a little bit of attention and effort, I think we could have salvaged a much better result out of what happened in Iraq. So yes, I focus on the SOFA, the Status of Forces Agreement. President Bush had laid down a series of conditions with the Iraqis. So one of them was the SOFA, and that wasn't achieved. But others included an oil law to talk about distribution of oil resources amongst the provinces, a thing about territorial dispute between the Kurds and the Arabs, a lot of things on guaranteeing the status of different ethnic groups so that to try to limit the conflict, and that was all in train. And with just a small amount of attention from the White House being continued after the administration changed, I think there could have been quite a different outcome. But the biggest thing was we had this very kind of insouciant attitude to violence. And you asked about the verdict on the surge. One of the worst things about the surge was people interpreted it as a victory, and they thought, well, we won this thing, so we can leave. But actually, it wasn't that, right? We had suppressed the violence, but almost as soon as we began to withdraw, the violence started to come back. And by mid-2011, there was already pretty significant signs of a resurgent al-Qaeda, which at that time was calling itself ISI, which is now Islamic State. By 2012, it was huge, you know, but we just didn't, we were locked in, unlike President Bush, who, for all of his mistakes, was willing to change course. President Obama set a course early and just has never deviated from that, even in the face of...
Essentially, you think if it was possible, the US should have stayed? Yeah,
I do. And not so much as keeping lots of troops on the ground, but maintaining the attention, right? And there are certain messages that only the president can deliver, unfortunately, you know, to another head of government. And I think, you know, Vice President Biden did a great job, but he's the vice president, you know, and other people are like, you know, what does the president think about that? You know, and I think so. There was a lack of diplomatic engagement and a lack of the military resources to back that up, right? I mean, Bismarck in the 19th century said that diplomacy without military might is like music without instruments, you know. So diplomacy is really important, but it has to be based on something, some kind of leverage, which we had given up significantly by the end of 2011.
Now, I want to now come to what is at the core of the essay, and which I think a lot of people here would be very interested in hearing more about, and that is what's now called Islamic State, but which was once Al-Qaeda in Iraq and then was ISIS. We can maybe use the terms, you know, at the right time, use the right term.
Sure.
Your essay is very interesting on the whole genealogy of ISIS, we'll call it. we're in a country, it's an astonishing thing for me, that the defence minister was recently asked on television the name of the head of the Islamic State, and he didn't know. And we also have a prime minister who on, I think, 400 occasions has characterised IS or ISIS as a death cult without showing any even interest in its genealogy, both intellectual and political. But could you say, I think the most important thing that has come out of, we now can see, coming out of the invasion of Iraq is ISIS. Say a little bit about its, where it started and its political, intellectual lineage.
Yeah, and I mean, I haven't tracked what people have said, to be honest, here about that, but you know, for what it's worth, I watched these guys evolve pretty up close and personal in 2005 to 2007, and then with the other work that we've done with NGOs and aid agencies in the region since, I've watched them, you know, evolve into ISIS. So just from, you know, one man's point of view, I think it really begins with Zarqawi, who's a Jordanian drug dealer, converts to militant Islam in prison in the 1990s. When he gets out, he goes to Afghanistan and he sets up a training camp in Herat, western Afghanistan. He's never associated directly with Al-Qaeda, and he never really acknowledges the authority of bin Laden. He's sort of running his own show there in western Iraq, in western Afghanistan. When we invade in 2001, he flees into Iran for a period and then makes his way to Iraq. And actually, I quote in the essay from a CIA cable that was only declassified fully about a month ago, which is the first time it's ever been fully revealed. But basically, he was in Baghdad or around Baghdad from about the middle of 2002, so 9 months before the invasion, expecting a US invasion of Iraq and setting up cells to be ready to deal with it. Not associated with Al-Qaeda at the time. And to our knowledge, not directly associated with the Baathists. He did later have a relationship with with Saddam Hussein's regime, but at the time, probably not. Now, you know, Dick Cheney and Colin Powell used his presence in Iraq to claim that Al-Qaeda was working with Saddam, but the evidence that we have today suggests that that was not the case. So Zarqawi's there, we invade. A lot of the worst atrocities the first year or two of the invasion have been painted in Western media as if they were just bumbling mistakes on the part of the occupation forces. And frankly, there were a lot of those. But in amongst those were some very carefully orchestrated incidents by Zarqawi's people. One of them was the contractor killings in northern Iraq that led to the breakdown of security in 2004. Another one was the killing of Sergio Vieira de Mello, who people may remember as the UN coordinator in East Timor. He was a great guy who was killed in August 2003 in a massive truck bombing that Zarqawi orchestrated. And the goal was to frighten and separate the international community from Iraqis and put us behind blast walls and armoured vehicles to get us out of the picture. And only once he'd achieved that at the end of 2003 did he begin to try to gin up this kind of sectarian conflict. Now, Zarqawi swore allegiance to Al-Qaeda in 2004 purely as a branding exercise. Right? He never took direction from them, and they had a brief relationship that seemed to be working, and it all went south really quickly. And the main reason was Al-Qaeda had a totally different ideology to, quote, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Zarqawi's group. AQ Central, guys like bin Laden and Zarqawi and Zawahiri in Pakistan, were all about the so-called apostate regimes in the Middle East, the same ones that got mainly overthrown in the Arab Spring. And their whole shtick was civilians can never overthrow these regimes. There's no way to deal with them because they're supported by the United States. So what we have to do is attack the far enemy, right? He says you have to cut the head off the snake, right? We have to punch past these regimes, attack America, get the Americans to do something crazy. Okay, that did work. And then that's going to result in America's support for these regimes collapsing, and the Americans will back out, and then we can take on these regimes directly. So that's the idea of Al-Qaeda Central. They want to take on America. Zarqawi's got a totally different theory, right? He sees Iran and the Shia as the main threat. He wants to provoke a sectarian civil war with the Shia. He sees the Americans as being at best a distraction, get these guys out of the way, and what we're going to do is we're going to generate such violence against our own Sunni community, that they're going to have to close ranks behind us. We're going to become like the vanguard of the Sunni community, and that's going to catapult us into this like state-like environment. And it's very clear when you think about the caliphate. For Al-Qaeda, central, like bin Laden, the caliphate was this kind of vague utopian ideal that worked precisely because it was vague, because it allowed all these people with different interests to say, oh yeah, we support the caliphate, and that was their sort of their unifying goal. For Zarqawi, it was an immediate, real-world goal to provoke that sectarian civil war, stand up an Islamic State, create the caliphate, and then expand it by relatively conventional, military means. The other important thing to note, and I'll be brief on this, is huge Ba'athist and former Saddam Hussein regime influence within AQI from the time when Zarqawi is killed in the middle of 2006. And Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the head of the Islamic State, was arrested in 2004, was in Camp Bucca in southern Iraq with a whole bunch of Baathists, got out of prison and powered up with them and created almost this hybrid former regime Ba'athist organisation with guys that were part of Al-Qaeda. And he, you look at his biography and it says that he was a student at the Islamic University of Baghdad, which sounds like an Islamic institution. It was actually a Ba'athist state organisation. So after the 1991 Gulf War, Saddam kind of Islamized Iraqi society and tried to bring the regime in alignment with Sunni Islam as a way of cementing his control. And Baghdadi is an example of that. So Baghdadi takes over in 2010 after some other guys are killed that were running the organisation. He brings with him this cadre of Baathists, and they basically proceed to assassinate all of his rivals within the organisation, cementing his authority. By the time bin Laden is killed in 2011, he's running this very tight ship. And when the Arab Spring happens and the Syrian civil war kicks off, he takes the opportunity to send a small cadre of guys to Syria, away from the targeting that we were able to put on them. And we can talk about the Syrian thing separately, but he comes to a very nice understanding with Bashar al-Assad, who's looking for a jihadist enemy that he can paint as, himself as the lesser of two evils. And so he finds the safe haven in Syria and basically rebuilds AQI from the ground up, this time calling it ISIS. Yeah. So the organisation we're dealing with now goes way back, goes back before 2001, but it's grown from being, a few guys in a camp in Afghanistan to being a guerrilla movement to being a pseudo-state to now being, I would argue, something that looks a lot more like an actual state.
A state enterprise.
Yeah.
But you said, and I completely agree, and I've learned from you and I've read other things, that Al-Qaeda and ISIS are ideologically very different and exactly in the way you describe. But on the other hand, what I don't think is well enough recognised is that they come from a similar part of the political spectrum of Islamism.
Yeah.
Call it, I think the word is generally now jihadi Salafism.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that? That
No, I do.
There are two interpretations of them, because by calling it a death cult, as our Prime Minister does, it doesn't locate it within an intellectual, political heritage.
So,
I think both the Zarqawi but also al-Baghdadi are ideologues in the deepest sense.
Yeah,
they're driven by an idea.
With respect to the Prime Minister's comment, I think it's very true that actually they do engage in some pretty death cult-like behaviour, right? But they're not just a death cult, I think would be my qualifying comment. I want to tell people that are going to read the essay that I did actually pull a couple of punches in describing just how horrible these guys were. So you'll read this and you'll think, geez, these guys were horrible. It was actually worse than I could even bring myself to write in the essay. But that horrible violence that they applied to innocent civilians in Iraq was in no way random, and it wasn't psychopathic, right? It was a rational political strategy to generate so much terror and fear on the part of Sunnis and so much anger on the part of Shia that the only choice for the Sunni would be to stand behind Al-Qaeda, then ISIS, as a way of protecting themselves against the enraged Shia. It was a very, very conscious strategy that was part of that. Now, as to the Islamic nature of it, the technical term would be neo-Salafi jihadism, right? But you can get all caught up on that. I think what I would say is that there's there's a religious element, there's a military element, and then there's a sort of political analysis that goes into both the Al-Qaeda and the ISIS ideology. The religious element, it's on the edge of mainstream, but it's not heretical. I mean, it's without getting into great detail, it's like Hanafi, Sunni Salafism. And there are plenty of people that believe roughly the same thing that are not in any way violent, right? So what that means is Islam is a factor, but it is not a sufficient explanation for what we're talking about now. Yeah. I've had people in the States say to me, well, this is all Islam. I mean, Islam's just a religion of violence. Well, you know, basic logic, you can't explain a variable effect with a constant cause, right? Islamic doctrine's been basically the same since the 13th century. We haven't seen this kind of violence in that whole time. So there's got to be something else going on, which is not to downplay Islam. It's just to say that you can't explain this just from that. I think where they differ is Al-Qaeda's analysis is fight the far enemy, drive the Americans out, create chaos, and then become the vanguard of this people's revolution against the apostates. And, you know, the big problem for Al-Qaeda was the Arab Spring, where a bunch of unarmed civilians achieved more in 6 months than they spent 20 years achieving, you know, and that really undermined their credibility. ISIS is a different theory based on a similar religious interpretation, but the theory is provoke this sectarian war, consolidate people behind the caliphate, and then expand by like aggressive territorial conquest. You know?
And how important was it in the rise of, we'll still call it ISIS, that they were able to make a break into Syria when Syrian society broke down because of the Arab Spring? Hugely
transformative. They wouldn't be where they are today without the ability to go into Syria. They
take large parts.
Yeah, well, what happened was, so initially al-Baghdadi sent a small cadre of his most experienced fighters into Syria, just to recover, basically. They went into eastern Syria. They didn't really fight the regime. They didn't do very much. They just spent their time building camps and recovering and getting back on their feet and recruiting. They had a lot of advantages because they were better organised than a lot of the Syrian rebels, and people went to them who weren't very ideological, but they were just the best game in town. And they, as I said, they were helped by Assad, who was looking for a jihadist enemy that he could paint himself as the alternative to.
So and what, to make himself...
Look like the lesser of two evils, basically, right? And there wasn't that initially, right? When he first started saying the enemy are all Al-Qaeda, there was a barefaced lie, right? But over time...
It became true.
Suddenly ISIS turned up and he's like, oh, hurrah, you know, I've got real jihadists now, you know? So he was able to work on that. And so there was a de facto truce between ISIS and the regime in Syria until really the middle of 2013. Yeah. So they had that space. But then, sorry, one other thing. At the end of 2012... he sent a really important Ba'athist guy called Haji Bakr, who was a Ba'athist intelligence officer who'd organised a lot of the secret cells in Iraq, sent him to Syria to turn the thing into more of a regular army. Yeah. And that's really, it's Haji Bakr's impetus that gets them the capability that allows them to go back into Iraq.
And we'll start at that. There are two big, you know, the great breakthrough, military breakthrough, where you call it, it's now a war of movement, where then can't be described any longer just as a terrorist movement or an insurgent movement. Right. There are two huge questions in my mind about the fact that they were able to take Mosul and you know, so militarily effective in Iraq. The Americans, these are the two questions. The Americans had put $25 billion, and the Australians, mainly the Americans, had put $25 billion into building up the Iraqi army, and it collapsed, you know, like a knife through melted butter. It just disintegrated. Second question. America has the most expensive, elaborate intelligence system in the history of humankind by a country mile, especially since 9/11, you know, where they collect every citizen's phone call. And they were, as you point out, Obama, because of the American intelligence community, were clueless in 2014 regarding ISIS.
Yeah.
How do you explain those two things?
Well, just to be a little more specific, what happened in the fall of Mosul was actually the 2nd Iraqi Army Division collapsed, right? The rest of the army is still relatively intact. But the problem is that the army that the coalition trained is not the army that was left in 2014, right? So at the end of US engagement, which is 2011, so Australian engagement ended a bit earlier, the army was relatively capable, had some good infantry units, pretty good police, pretty decent communications, and there was a lot of rather technocratic, military type guys running the organisations. And I talk about this in the essay, actually. When Maliki had a free hand after the coalition left, he began to replace all those guys. And he took people that were loyal politically to his party and replaced these technocrats with those guys. And he also replaced a lot of the Sunni police in Sunni areas with Shia police. And he did a lot of other changes like that, which led to a rise in corruption and a sort of hollowing out of the military structure to the point where a lot of the headquarters were staffed by basically time-serving, nepotistic, corrupt guys. And when the time came, they just couldn't fight and they just collapsed. And actually the troops within the Iraqi Army 2nd Division, I had 2 analysts in Mosul very shortly before the collapse, were quite good, but they didn't have any leadership, so they fled. So that's the answer to the first question is, the army that we trained is not the army that is there now. And part of the problem now is trying to rebuild that, and I'm not actually sure it's doable after all this time. So that's one question.
A failure of American intelligence.
So I think you're letting the president, I'm not partisan here, but I think you're letting the president off too lightly there. So the CIA issued a national intelligence estimate in 2012, which has since been published, warning of the rise of ISIS. They issued another one in 2013, warning even more sharply of the fact that the country was starting to fall apart. The intelligence community did not miss the rise of ISIS. There were people in the intelligence community screaming about this for several months, for 18 months before the collapse. Also, think tanks like the Institute for the Study of War, Center for New American Security, a few others had published papers saying, hey, this is going badly. But our eye was most certainly off the ball. And it wasn't that we were focusing on Afghanistan instead of Iraq. We're focusing on other stuff entirely. And as I say in the essay, I think the reason for that was the killing of Osama bin Laden, because we hyped up the killing of bin Laden and we said, hey, look, we killed bin Laden, so we can go back to normal now and the wars are ending. And we sort of talked ourselves into this soothing narrative that it was winding down, when actually the data was telling us the opposite. So I think a lot of things that get described as intelligence failures in my book are actually decision-making failures, where the data is there, but there's like a breakdown between the intelligence professional and the policymaker, and the decision isn't followed through on. And I think that was very much the case with ISIS.
And we get now to, it's very important conceptually for you to say that when ISIS becomes IS, the Islamic State, or just we'll call it Islamic State, it's no longer to be thought of as a terrorist or a counter-insurgent movement, but what you call, I think, a state-building enterprise.
Right.
Why is it conceptually important to see that, do you think?
Well, I think it comes down to threat analysis. So just to very quickly cover the state argument, and I know it's controversial, and I know that there's been politicians who've said, ISIS is neither Islamic nor a state, got it, and I see the propaganda value of denying them the legitimacy that is involved. But, if we think about international relations and we think about the criteria to be considered a state in international relations, there are many sources of ways to think about that, and it's not something that IR people agree on, and I'm not an IR person, right? But to the extent that I'm familiar with it, the sort of 4 classic traditional requirements come from the Montevideo Convention of 1933, which say that to which the US is a signatory, by the way, not Australia, which say that you have to have a territory, like a spatial territory. You have to have a permanent or fixed population that resides within that territory. You have to have a government that exercises control over that population, and that government has to be capable of entering into relations with other states. That's the words of the treaty. Now, it specifically says that it doesn't have to be recognised by any other state. It's still de facto a state if it has those 4 criteria. When we think about those 4 criteria, ISIS controls territory about the size of Israel or Lebanon in Syria and Iraq. It controls a population which, as of the fall of Ramadi, is about the size of Norway or Singapore, which is a permanent population. It exercises a wide range of governance functions, taxation, essential services, courts, hospital administration, education, across that territory. You might disagree with the way that they do it, but that's not a criteria. Otherwise, places like North Korea wouldn't be states. It's the effectiveness of the government, not whether we like its policies. The fourth one, the ability to enter into relations with other states, well, they have what they call a cyber caliphate. They issue communiques. They have been accused of taking donations from a variety of states. They sell electricity to the Syrian government. They sell oil on the international market through Turkey, and they sell antiquities, which is illegal, but they're still doing that through the international market. So I would argue that they are either there or almost there on most of those criteria. They also think they're a state, they claim to be a state, and they fight like a state, which is really important. So I think they're, and I don't call them a state, what I say is they're a state-building enterprise. They're trying to become a state. And so getting to threat, that element is what I think is the most threatening thing about the Islamic State, and something that we really need to be taking much more seriously than I think we are. Although I'll note that Julie Bishop seems to be thinking in that direction in terms of some of the comments that she's been making. But, you know, if you think about the threats that come out of the Islamic State, one of them is, you know, radicalisation of people in our own communities. And I don't have to tell people in Melbourne, you know, how that can happen. The second one is foreign fighters, which is getting a lot of attention right now. The idea that people will go and fight in Syria and then possibly come back and attack Australia. The third is the effect of the rise of ISIS on all other terrorist groups globally, and it's had this massive reinvigorating effect. And then the fourth is, it is a state-building enterprise in the heart of the Middle East that's completely redrawing the map, tearing up the Sykes-Picot Treaty that's, you know, set the borders of the modern Middle East in the 1920s. And more importantly, it's drawing in the Turks, the Russians, the Iranians, the Israelis, the Saudis into this, what was a Cold War between Sunni and Shia organisations, that's now become a hot war between Iran on the one hand and a collection of Sunni states on the other. And, you know, Iran, Saudi, Pakistan, Israel and Russia, that's 5 players involved in that, are all either nuclear powers or threshold nuclear powers. So I think that the risk here is not a few terrorists coming back and mounting attacks in Australia. Only a total of 50 people have been killed in those kinds of attacks in the last 6 years, right? So it's not, it's bad for that. If it happens to you, it's unlucky, but it's not, you know, it's not a national security threat. The threat is not remote radicalisation. Police can deal with that. The threat is, you know, a hot war that goes nuclear in the Middle East. And I think that's the bit that has to have much more of our attention.
And we have to make sure there's time for people to ask questions, but I've got a couple of big questions.
Yeah.
We come now to what really is the most controversial part of the essay, which is your recommendations. I mean, I'm going to quote from someone who was involved in the surge and wrote New York Times, General Bolger, who says, if insanity is defined as doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results, I think we're there. And he's talking about the thing you propose, which is a more US and ally ground troops in Iraq.
I'm not proposing ground troops. He may be, but I'm not proposing additional ground troops, no. But I'm not proposing anything, right? I'm just saying what I think ought to be done based on the discussion.
Well, then I've misread the essay. I thought...
Well, maybe that's my editor's fault. Where is he? That's, of course, it's my fault. No, I think what I'm saying is actually a little different from that. I'm saying that we need to treat ISIS like a state, and we need to remove the elements that make it a state, so its control of territory, its government, and all those elements that make it that threat that's creating the conflict. And you can't do that with the operation as currently structured. And I recommend really 2 things. One is, actually 3. One is a significant increase in the amount of airstrikes being put in, right? And I think people need to realise that the average number of airstrikes that we're launching in Iraq and Syria today is about 10 per day. Putting that in comparison, in the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, we did roughly 90 per day. In the fight in Libya in 2011, it was 45 per day. In Kosovo, which most people have probably even forgotten by now, in 1999, we were doing 250 airstrikes a day. So you could be running a much more significant air campaign that was doing significant damage to ISIS as a state. And we're actually not doing that. We're targeting individual artillery pieces and weapon systems and trying to kill individual leaders. Like, we're still thinking like it's a terrorist organisation. It's not. It's a state. There's a whole 10 square block area in western Mosul, which is the ISIS government complex for western Iraq, that we could be removing from the map, you know, like we would have done in Kosovo or in the fight in Libya. So I'm recommending an air campaign only on the same scale as roughly Kosovo or Libya.
And not I thought you were saying that the you can't win a victory over, and you want ISIS to be destroyed, or IS to be destroyed. You can't win without US troops.
So I'm not recommending more ground troops. What I'm recommending is a change to the way that we're using the advisors, okay? So the advisors right now are restricted to what's called advise and assist, which means they can train people and they can give them all care, no responsibility, and then when they leave the wire, they basically kiss them goodbye and there's no further support. Also, we're not putting observers on the ground to control the airstrikes, which is one of the reasons why we're not having the impact on the air. I think that a relatively simple change in rules of engagement, which said advise, assist and accompany, which is an authorised approach, where our guys would actually, Americans, Brits, Australians and so on, would actually go out with their supported unit and advise them in the field, as distinct from just training them, would make a huge difference to their capability. And secondly, having what are called JTACs, Joint Terminal Air Controllers, who could actually direct the fire where it needs to go, would significantly impact on the effectiveness of their campaign. I reckon that would probably be enough. There are people
to win.
To remove the elements of ISIS that make it the basis for this regional environment. So you would reduce it to the level where the Iraqis can handle it, right? There are people in the States that are calling for like 30,000 ground troops and 10,000. I don't support that. I think that's just trying to do the surge again, right? Which maybe that's what Dan Bolger's talking about. I mean, we know how that worked out the first time. It's not going to be any better this time. But we've got to be doing more to, because again, one of the points I'm making in the thing is the choice is not between us mounting more of an intervention and no intervention. The choice is either it's internationally led in accordance with international norms on about the scale of Kosovo or Libya, or the Iranians are going to do it, right? And that's what they're doing now. And it's because the Iranians are coming in with this Shia militia who are carrying out a lot of atrocities on the ground that people like the Saudis and everybody else are spinning up, and we're starting to get this regional conflict. So it's about basically saying, like the international community taking more of an umpiring role and saying, we're going to sort this out, you guys need to stand down and we need to calm down this conflict that's rapidly escalating. The third thing that I'm recommending, which is not military, but is actually even more important, is we've got to start thinking about how to make peace in Syria. Because actually Syria is the driver of a lot of what we're seeing, and it's sort of the vacuum that's sucking a lot of these people in. So we could solve ISIS in Iraq, but if we don't deal with Syria, we still have the same problem in another year or two. And that's a peace strategy. That's not a military strategy. It's about getting people to the peace table to the point where they can see a negotiated outcome as a better solution than continuing to fight each other. And one of the reasons why that hasn't happened to date is we've had disarray on the part of the international community, and we haven't had the engagement on the peace process that we really need to see.
But for that to work, you'd have to also destroy IS in
Syria. To get to the point where you can have that negotiation, you need to change the military reality on the ground. Yeah, Syria we haven't really talked about. It's a whole different kettle of fish, right? Because you've got a big Jabhat al-Nusra, a big Al-Qaeda organisation in Syria, and one of the greatest achievements of IS is they've actually managed to make Al-Qaeda look reasonable by comparison. And you've got nationalist groups and a bunch of other groups. So it's a very different picture from what we see in Iraq. But one of the things I say in the essay is after we pushed bin Laden out of Afghanistan, we had this really complex problem going on in Pakistan. And instead of dealing with that, because it was too complicated to think about, we just went and invaded Iraq because it was simpler, right? Syria is to Iraq today the way that Pakistan was to Afghanistan in 2001. It's that complex problem. No one wants to look at it. It's all too hard. But actually that's where we've got to put a lot of our intellectual effort, or you could throw 1 million troops into Iraq. It wouldn't make a difference unless you solve that problem.
Thank you. You recommended more use of air strikes. How do you get those observers on the ground to guide the strikes in a proxy foreign country, foreign state? How do you get a long-term presence of those observers in there?
I don't think we're looking at long-term as in years. I think it's a matter of months. But I'll give you a good example. Up in Kurdistan, there are a number of training teams engaged supporting the Kurds who are fighting a fairly intense fight with ISIS east of Mosul. I won't name countries, but 3 of the 4 countries that are training have sent trainers in to locations about 10 miles behind the lines, and they've set up training schools, and they're waiting for the Kurds to come back for training, and no one's turning up because you know what? They're busy fighting ISIS on the front line. The fourth country has put its trainers right on the front line, and they are just doing training. They're not engaging in combat, but they've been highly effective because they're there, right? They're being welcomed. There's not a lot of pushback on their presence because they're actually contributing. So like they might spend the morning training these guys on, you know, how to fire a mortar, and then in the afternoon the Kurds practice it by firing on the ISIS guys. So it's pretty close to combat, but it isn't. I mean, it's just support. It's more complex in the Arab part of the country because there are these very powerful Shia militias that don't want to see US presence, and actually during the fighting in Tikrit, they actually stood down rather than continue fighting when US air power turned up. But actually there are Arab countries in the coalition that are much more acceptable to these players who have perfectly good JTACs. So we don't necessarily have to be putting like Aussie boys or Americans on the front line. One other caveat that I'll just say, so you know Ramadi fell over the weekend. Aussies and Kiwis are in the training base at Taji, which is an area just north of Baghdad. That is 60 miles, it's less than 60 miles from Ramadi. Right? So it's a bit of a fantasy to think that we can keep our boys safe by keeping them behind the wire. The wire is not going to be much of a protection if this thing continues to escalate. And your choices are, you know, pull out and accept defeat, or think about a closer engagement. So, like, no perfect answer. I mean, I don't want to give the impression that it would be easy at all. I guess what I'm trying to say is whatever we've been doing to date for the last 10 months, it ain't working. And we need to rethink that because otherwise it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Big question. What would a peace situation in Syria look like, do you think?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? I think, so we've, just by way of background, we've been working with aid groups and peace activists in Syria for about, since 2011. And that answer changes a lot over time. But I think that it starts with the recognition that Assad is not going to be able to reconquer the whole of the country, and I think he and more importantly his generals recognise that. It also is the recognition that with a Russian naval base at Tartus and very significant Iranian, Hezbollah and Russian support for Assad, the rebels are not going to be able to overthrow Assad. People have to recognise there is actually no military solution that gets them to their overall goal. A lot of Syrian peace activists who I've talked to, I won't name names, have said a year ago or 2 years ago, we said the regime has to go. And we wanted to see the Syrian Opposition Council or some of those other groups step up and become a provisional government. Now we think, and this is a conversation from a couple of months ago, now we think that actually Assad and his family need to go, but the regime needs to stay. We need to have like a transitional regime that's based on the structure of the Syrian state as it exists. The problem with that is Jabhat al-Nusra, right? So there's been a lot of, or at the Islamic Front more broadly, which is the group around Jabhat al-Nusra and some of its allies, Ara al-Sham and a few others, if you're familiar with those groups. They've gained a lot of ground in the last 6 weeks in northern Syria, and that changes the calculus for a lot of other players. And I think that if you're going to get people to the point where they're ready to make peace, you've got to do something about ISIS. You've got to think about what you're going to do about Jabhat al-Nusra. I don't think there's necessarily a military solution here, right? But then the other players are the Turks and the nationalist Syrians. And one of our problems here is we have been unwilling to commit to regime change in Syria, and we actually called our own bluff in 2013 over Syrian weapons of mass destruction. And so a lot of Syrians don't want to support a Western effort that's only going to either favour ISIS or it's going to favour Assad, right? I mean, if we bomb ISIS and Assad steps into the gap, that doesn't get anywhere for people that are in their revolution because they want to overthrow Assad. But likewise, if we destroy Assad and it becomes a bunch of jihadists running the country, that doesn't work for a lot of Syrians either. So I think it's about finding that balance. Only Syrians can find that, but it has to be, we have to set the conditions militarily to make that possible. And unfortunately, I don't see a lot of prospect that people are thinking along those lines right now. People are recreating the tunnel vision on Iraq that we had for a long time there during the occupation. And I think that's dangerous when you want to think about a long-term solution.
About the role being played by Russia, you touched on it, but other than within Syria, are there other covert or overt roles that Russia is playing? Because we don't hear about it.
Yeah, well, Russia is playing a huge role with advisors and trainers, money, political support, and so on. It's easy to critique the Russians and say, you know, these guys are bad, but it's important to see it from their standpoint. And the big developments, I think, for the Russians were the Libya operation in 2011, and then the Syrian weapons of mass destruction issue in August of 2013. So when the uprising happened against Gaddafi, there was a series of UN meetings that resulted in a UN Security Council resolution which was about protecting civilians on the ground in Libya. I think people probably remember this, right? It was supposed to be a humanitarian protective operation, and the resolution specifically forbade the use of ground occupation forces in the engagement in Libya. The Russians eventually acceded to that vote in the Security Council, but they added a rider to their statement which said that they were only approving it because they saw it as fundamentally humanitarian nature, not against the regime or against anybody else, but about stabilising the situation. We start the operation, and then opportunism takes hold, and people see the opportunity to get rid of Gaddafi for good, and it rapidly transitions from being humanitarian protection of people in eastern Libya to being NATO air support for the rebels to overthrow Gaddafi. And the Russians are pissed about that, right? They see that as a betrayal and as a sort of bait and switch. So when the resolution comes up for discussion for Syria a couple of years later, they're like, no way, we're not talking about it. So they've actually significantly hampered efforts to come up with a robust UN resolution on ending the war in Syria, precisely because they feel like they were burned over the Libya operation. And then the other thing with the Russians is what happened in August of 2013. So they've been very supportive of Assad. They've got a very clear strategy, which is, you know, we don't want to see these jihadists anywhere, and we will take anything as an alternative, and Assad's our man. And they supported Assad even up to the point when his regime used nerve gas in August of 2013 against Syrian civilians. US had said that that would be a red line, you know, that if that happened, there would be the chance of military intervention. But when it came to the point, they really didn't want to do that. And the Americans were looking for an out and a way to avoid that. President Obama put it to Congress, which he actually doesn't have to do and hasn't done in a number of other cases, but he did it as a way of sort of putting up a roadblock to his own so-called red line. And Secretary of State Kerry made a statement in Paris during a conference. Somebody asked him, well, was there anything that Assad could do to avert this military operation? And he said, well, he could give up all of his weapons of mass destruction, but that's not going to happen. And Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, jumped on that as the basis for a deal and basically saved the Obama administration from its own error and put together the deal that ended that supposedly ended Syrian weapons of mass destruction. So the Russians came to the end of 2013 feeling like they had won, like they won one. They lost Libya, but they won the issue in 2013 over weapons of mass destruction. And you can look at a lot of the Russian aggression in Ukraine and Crimea and the Baltic states, and if you put a timeline on that, it dates very much from that period when we called our own bluff in Syria. And I think what we essentially did was telegraphed to the Russians exactly the extent of our political will and how far we were prepared to go, and that allowed them to manoeuvre around that. I think Russia's running its own foreign policy that isn't all about the United States, but a large part of it is about seeking to relitigate the outcome of not so much the Cold War, but what happened with the expansion of NATO after the Cold War, and to try to roll back some of what they perceive as unwarranted US influence in their near abroad. And that includes Syria, because Syria is a long-standing Russian ally.
I think we've really passed the time, but we'll have one last question and then we'll have to, unfortunately, wind up.
Well, I hope it's not a too long a one. But yeah, look, it always seemed to me that the Israel-Palestine question, the continuing occupation of Palestine and repression of Palestinians had a lot to do with the radicalisation in the region as a whole. But I'd just like your comment on the relative strength of that as compared to, obviously, you know, you've already said how much the 2003 invasion of Iraq basically left this power vacuum, and maybe Islamic State wouldn't even exist now if that hadn't have happened. But yeah, how would you rate the Palestine thing as opposed to the invasion of Iraq?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you that ISIS wouldn't exist except for the invasion of Iraq. I mean, it's a creature of the invasion of Iraq, but it's also a creature of the precipitate withdrawal from Iraq. You know, it was both those things, and therefore plenty of blame, you know, to go around for everybody. I want to preface this by saying I'm not an Israel-Palestine expert. I've never done field work in Israel, so I only know sort of what I read, you know, the same as you guys. I have talked to a few Israeli diplomats on the question, and a lot of Palestinians as well. But to the extent that I'm able to comment on it, I think that it certainly is an issue. How I would characterise it is it actually goes back to the 1978 Camp David Accords under President Carter, where the Arab regimes led by initially Egypt made a formal peace agreement with Israel, and the other Arab states made kind of de facto you know, peace of various kinds, and that was seen as fundamentally illegitimising those regimes by people like Zawahiri and people that eventually ended up in Al-Qaeda, because they saw that as completely, you know, you're now making a peace deal with the Zionist entity, so you're no longer legitimate as any kind of government in a Muslim country. And so from that peace deal, and you know, out of the peace deal comes guaranteed military aid for both Egypt and Israel, right? That's part of that deal. And so we continue to pump a lot of military assistance to Israel and to Egypt because of the requirements of the Camp David Accords. And so that 78 deal is what leads to the rise of a lot of radical groups in Egypt, including Zawahiri's group, which is involved in the 1981 assassination of Anwar Sadat, from which this massive original crackdown, which actually brings to life Egyptian Islamic Jihad, right? So which is Zawahiri's group, which is one half of Al-Qaeda when it's formed in the 80s. The other half is Bin Laden's group, the so-called Arab Services Bureau, and that comes from a much more Saudi critique. And I think Bin Laden often quoted and talked about Palestine as a significant issue, but he quoted Chechnya and he quoted Iraq and he quoted a bunch of others as well. He was looking for a variety of grievances, and I'm not sure that Palestine was the top of his list. For Bin Laden, the top of his list was what was going on in Saudi Arabia itself, and the fact that he didn't see the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as fully living up to the obligations that it had as keeper of the holy places of Islam and as head of the Wahhabi religion.
American troops.
Yeah, and having American troops based there after Saddam's invasion of Kuwait and so on. In fact, one of the rationales that the Americans put forward for the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was that it would allow them to remove those garrisons from Saudi Arabia, which was one of Bin Laden's big grievances, which, you know, again, it shows you the weakness of some of the thinking here, right? It's like, oh, you're unhappy because of that? All right, I'm going to smack you over here, and oh, are you happy now? You know, we didn't sort of think that through. But I think, so it's definitely there, it's definitely a factor. It is certainly a motivator for some of the people involved, but I don't really have the data to say whether it's like the motivator or just one of a group. My impression is it's the latter. It's sort of one of a group of things that are motivating this activity.
Sadly, we have to end at some point, and that point has arrived. I think we've been incredibly privileged to not only hear someone who is so attuned to what's happening in Washington, our great and powerful friend, but also who has the most astonishing understanding and knowledge of an almost impossibly complex region and troublesome region. We've really been privileged to hear you tonight. It's a great quarterly essay. I really recommend it, and I'd like you to thank David very much for his generous